Hello, my name is Michael Gerard. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School and director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, and it's my privilege to moderate this webinar that we're having. This is an American Society of Environmental Law event. It's part of the New Professionals Interest Group Getting Started series, and this particular event is co-sponsored by the International Environmental Law Interest Group. We have with us three very distinguished practitioners of international environmental law, and what we'll be doing for the next 50 minutes or so is to talk about what people do in the field and how they get into it and what the prospects are. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of our three speakers, and after I introduce that person, I will ask them a question, and then when we're done with that, I'll have some other rounds of questions. But if any of you have questions you would like to put to any of us, please send an email to events@asil.org, and we will address them. So our first speaker is Susan Binias, who has been in the legal advisor's office at the State Department since 1984. She worked on legal issues related to the Middle East, diplomacy, and outer space before turning to oceans, environmental, and scientific affairs, which has remained her specialization. She was the head of the Oceans and Environment Office for many years before becoming a deputy legal advisor. As deputy until 2013, she also supervised the Treaty Office in issues related to human rights, the Western Hemisphere, law enforcement, and private international law. She's been the principal lawyer on the climate change negotiations since 1989, and now is and that is now her main focus. She attended Yale College and Columbia Law School, and clerked for Judge Dorothy Nelson of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So, Susan, we're delighted to have you on, and I wanted to put to you the question that I'm going to ask to each of the others at first. Beyond what I just laid out in the little bio of you, can you describe a little bit about what you do? What's the nature of your job?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. As you stated, I'm a lawyer at the State Department, and what that means is we're lawyers to the policy bureaus at the State Department. In particular, what we call clients are the Special Envoy for Climate Change at the State Department, which is a position that was created by Hillary Clinton a few years ago, and other policy officials who work in the office dedicated to climate change. And as lawyers to the Special Envoy and these other policy officials, we have several roles. We negotiate parts of international agreements. Sometimes they're legal agreements, sometimes they're policy documents. We advise behind the scenes on possible positions for the United States to take, strategy. We do a lot of drafting, so we actually write a lot of the language for various agreements, joint statements, etc. The next big event on the horizon, as many people know, is the adoption of the agreement in Paris this December. That's going to be a culmination of 4 years of negotiations. So everything at the moment is geared towards that event. So we lawyers have been extremely busy running around. There are all kinds of meetings, especially this year, bilateral, multilateral, global, and we're pretty much dragged into all of those on the road to Paris. So that's what I'm keeping busy with at the moment.
Terrific, thank you. I'm now going to introduce Anastasia Telesetsky. She joined the University of Idaho College of Law in 2009 after 8 years as a practicing attorney in California, Washington, and abroad. Her practice focused on public international law and environmental law. She had the distinction of representing the government of Ethiopia before the Ethiopia-Eritrea Claims Commission at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. In 2003 and 2004, she was a Bosch Fellow in Germany, where she worked for the German Foreign Ministry on promoting international food security, and assisted in drafting guidelines on implementation of the right to food. As a Fulbright Fellow and a Berkeley Human Rights Center Fellow, she collaborated with communities in the Philippines and Papua New Guinea on developing culturally appropriate legal solutions to environmental protection problems. In addition to bachelor's and master's degrees in anthropology, Professor Telesensky earned her law degree at the University of California at Berkeley and an LLM in international law from the University of British Columbia. So Anastasia, we're very pleased to have you with us, and we'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Thanks so much for letting me participate on this distinguished panel. So thank you to the new members group and to the International Environmental Law Group. I'm a professor, as Professor Gerard just indicated. I teach primarily international environmental law and public international law. I teach in the Natural Resource and Environmental Law program. And what I see myself as doing, what I see the sort of academics doing in this field, is really being sort of idea entrepreneurs. We are looking at problems. We have the luxury of having some distance from the problems, unlike some of our colleagues who are working in the sort of government sector. And so a lot of what I think we're doing is doing a couple different kinds of work. Some of my colleagues do empirical work. They're trying to test assumptions. Others, such as myself, are very interested in normative work, and we do a lot of work trying to figure out how can we improve policies. I love what I do. I have the pleasure of teaching. I hope some of the folks out there in cyberspace, I hope some of you are students. I have the pleasure of teaching the next generation of lawyers, helping them to think through how to sort of realize, put their values into their practice. I do some teaching also over the summer. I work in China. I teach at a couple summer schools. And for me, that's really a pleasure. The students are fantastic, and I really think that countries such as China are leading us forward in terms of some of the practices and some of just the speed of sort of uptake of new sort of environmental policy ideas. So that's a little bit about what I do on a daily basis.
Terrific. And now I'm going to introduce Martin Wagner, who's the director of the International Program of EarthJustice, which is based in San Francisco. The international program protects the human rights of all people to a clean and healthy environment through application of international, foreign, and U.S. law. Martin graduated from Whitman College with a degree in geology, and then became a community development volunteer with the Peace Corps in Senegal, West Africa. He attended the University of Virginia Law School, where he was executive editor of the Virginia Journal of International Law. Before coming to EarthJustice in 1996, Martin was a law clerk for Judge Robert Beezer of the Ninth Circuit and spent 5 years litigating environmental citizen suits in U.S. courts and representing victims of human rights violations in international institutions. Martin also teaches international environmental law and international trade in the environment at the Golden Gate University School of Law. He is fluent in English, Spanish, French, and Pular Fulani. Martin, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, thank you, Michael, and it's really nice to be here as well. So EarthJustice is a public interest environmental law organization, and as an organization as a whole, our role is to bring the public, non-governmental voice to environmental protection and give the public a role in protecting the environment. So I had a team of lawyers and scientists who are doing that in the international realm, and I would say we do it in a a number of different ways. We work on creating international legal protections, so we bring the non-governmental piece of what Susan was talking about doing in terms of the international negotiations. We're doing that in the climate negotiations. We're doing it in negotiations to create and strengthen international environmental protections for the Arctic, for example. We also work on applying the law as it applies to international environmental issues. So in some instances that may mean using international tribunals where they exist to try to enforce environmental or other protections that would address environmental concerns. Sometimes it means using U.S. or other foreign domestic courts. And we work on capacity building and creating cross-border collaboration among public interest lawyers so that we can strengthen the public's role in protecting the environment. We do that on a number of, we do all of this on a number of different issues. As I mentioned, climate, the Arctic, the oceans are another place where we do a lot of this kind of work to protect the environment internationally.
Terrific. And I'll just say a little bit about myself, since the work I now do heavily involves international law. I grew up as a domestic environmental lawyer. I graduated from law school in 1978 and went to work for a small environmental boutique firm in New York City called Burley Cass & Case, and I practiced there until 1994 when that firm broke up. In 1994, I moved laterally to the New York office of Arnold & Porter and practiced environmental law there full-time until the end of 2008, when and in the beginning of 2009, I became a full-time professor at Columbia Law School and founded what we now call the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which is focused on developing legal techniques to fight climate change, and both at the domestic and the international level, and to train lawyers and others in how to work with those fields, and then produce a lot of reference resources. We do a lot of work in particular with the small island nations that are endangered by sea level rise and other environmental threats. So having said that, I'd now like to start seeking advice from all of you. When young lawyers come up to you and say, I would love to get into international law, how do I get involved? I'd be interested in your thoughts on various possible career paths and what people should do. So Susan, could I start with you?
Yeah, sure. So people do come up to me a lot and say they're either interested in international law generally or international environmental law in particular, or even more particularly climate change work. I don't know that much about careers outside the State Department since I've been there for over 30 years, so I tend to give my answer in terms of the State Department. At the State Department, we have a rotation policy under which you can't just come in and work on a particular issue. So so my advice to somebody who's only interested in international environmental law is that it's probably not the best place to come, because you'll probably spend large parts of your career not doing international environmental law. But if people are interested in international law more generally, or international environmental law, but also other aspects of international law, then I highly recommend it as a place to come. I don't think you need a background in international environmental law at all. I know I didn't have one. I never took a course in environmental law or international environmental law, and you just kind of pick it up as you go along from negotiation to negotiation, and kind of develop your own view of the field from working in it, maybe from the bottom up rather than the top down. Some people who come to our office don't even have a background in international law. They never took a course, but they decide later that they're interested in it. And I think the best background is just a solid legal background, because a lot of what we do is not really based on knowledge of a particular field. It's more based on skills. So a lot of what we're doing is, advocacy, which just amounts to coming up with the best arguments to advance a particular point of view. Let's say the U.S. government point of view, or within the government, the State Department view, or within the State Department, the legal office's point of view. And a lot of what we do is problem solving. So whether that's within the U.S. government or between or among countries, a lot of what we do is sit around and listen to people advocate different views and try to find the sweet spot among all those views, and so that our negotiations can proceed. So in some senses, you don't need a lot of knowledge to do that. You just have to develop skills in terms of listening, writing, thinking. So anyway, I highly recommend State Department as a place to come. And again, I don't think it requires any particular kind of environmental background if you want to end up rotating into the office that does international environmental law. Thanks.
Susan, if I could just ask you, does the State Department hire lawyers straight out of law school, or do they expect them to have other work experience before they apply?
People come with all levels of experience. So they come straight from law school. They come after clerking. Some people come after a few years in the private sector. And we even have people come sort of later on in their careers. I'd say most people come straight out of law school or after clerking or after maybe a couple years at a law firm. That would be the most normal career path. And a lot of people come for just a short period and then go off and teach. So we actually have people rotating in and out quite frequently.
And are all the jobs in DC?
Actually, we have a couple positions scattered around the world, and those change according to what's going on in the world. So we generally have a couple positions.
Did we lose you? I'm going to ask the technical people. I'm not hearing Susan, and I see a frozen face.
Sorry, there's a technical glitch here.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Welcome back.
Thanks. We generally have a couple of positions in The Hague, where originally that was because of the U.S.-Iran Claims Tribunal, and now it's more generally because of the ICJ, Permanent Court of Justice, the various criminal tribunals. We have positions in Geneva because that's a hub for the UN and for UN negotiations. There are a couple positions people rotate to in New York at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. And then we have various other places. On occasion, we've had positions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and those will depend on what's happening in the world. So some people who are interested in living abroad for a while and seeing the State Department from kind of a different point of view, that's an option. We also have a bunch of what we call details, so that if you come to the office, you can spend some time working at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, getting the other side of the treaty process, or the NSC, National Security Council, legal office, a couple other parts of the government, and occasionally policy offices will take people on detail from the legal office just to give people a different point of view.
And do people apply just by poking around your website, or what's the method for doing that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. You just send a resume to our Human Resources Department, the Division of Legal Advisor's Office that deals with applications, and then people will be called in for interviews. We also recruit on campus. So there's a summer program after second year of law school, and recruiters will go to many law schools and interview, and also after third year of law school.
One thing I'll note, and it follows up from what you said, is that I find that a large percentage of the law professors who teach international law of any kind, and lawyers in private practice who practice international law, many of them came out of the State Department. That's where they got their initial training and learned how to be international lawyers. So some people stay throughout their careers, but others get their start in international law at the State Department and then move on.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And a lot of the professors, it's funny how their specialties in academics usually derive from whatever office they happen to rotate through, during their first or second rotation at the State Department. That became their passion, and then they went on to work in that field. Yeah, so we do have sort of an extended family of people who either work in our office or have worked in our office, and it's one of the nice aspects of the job.
Great. So Anastasia, let me ask you the same question. When students or young lawyers come to you and say, how do I become involved in international environmental law, what do you tell them?
I have two pieces of advice typically for the students. I mean, the first thing I tell them is to be proactive, because these sorts of opportunities are not going to be presented. It's not typical for a firm to come to the law school or for a nonprofit to come to the law school and offer these kinds of opportunities. And so I think a lot of it depends on the students soliciting, in particular, internships when they're first-year law students or second-year law students, on something they're interested in. I mean, and there are so many groups, if you're thinking internationally, particularly community groups in many parts of the world, in many parts of the global south, that could very much use the assistance of a law student to help them. And so one of the things that was in my bio is when I was a first-year law student, I spent the summer in Papua New Guinea, thanks to the Center for International Environmental Law, working with a people's group, the Monogalas Plateau group, looking at some very, very specific issues about the mining laws of Papua New Guinea and sort of community rights. And so that opportunity, frankly, was sort of a launching space for me, because it really opened up a world that I wasn't aware of. So I really encourage students to follow their passion in that sense while they have this opportunity to do something with the summer that they feel that they can make a contribution. So that's sort of the first piece of advice. But obviously, you can't be an intern for life. So my second piece of advice is to keep your mind open, because there's a lot of international opportunities. And the Department of State is obviously a premier place to work, but there's lots of other government agencies that have international opportunities. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is looking at issues with wildlife trafficking, which is an international environmental issue. The Coast Guard is concerned with pollution, oil pollution, and issues involving MARPOL. The Department of Defense has issues that arise over various aspects of international environmental law, when they're doing a base closure, for example. Or they're involved with endangered species, like in Okinawa with the dugong. So there's so many different opportunities. NOAA offers opportunities. The Department of Interior offers opportunities. And so that's something for students that think, well, you know, I'm not sure I'll be able to find an opportunity in the Department of State. There's lots of other opportunities. And so I would encourage you, I mean, one way is obviously looking on the various websites of the agencies. There's obviously also the government jobs webpage. So those are the things that I strongly encourage students, as well as applying for any sorts of fellowships. A lot of universities will offer one-year fellowships for graduates in order to do research projects. It's a great way to sort of see whether an academic career is something you might be interested in. And then there's also obviously the Fulbright fellowships that I strongly, strongly encourage law students to apply for.
Can you just say a word about the Fulbrights, because I'm not sure everybody is familiar with them, what they are, how they work?
Absolutely. So I know that when I was at law school, the Fulbright Foundation will offer a limited number of student fellowships, and these are paid for by the U.S. government. They are done in cooperation with countries around the world who seek to have Fulbright fellows. I had the honor of going to the Philippines to work with a fabulous non-governmental organization there, the Environmental Law Assistance Center, and I spent 9 months there working with lawyers. And I know that this is an opportunity that is available for students. Many of the Fulbrights, for those who are not bilingual, English is an option, but if you happen to be bilingual, there are many other countries that would also be available to you. And you'd either work with a nonprofit group, or you might work with the university. And so for the students thinking about this, or others who might be thinking about this, check out the Fulbright Foundation website, because it will have all the deadlines and requirements.
Terrific. So Martin, what do you tell young law students or young lawyers who are interested in getting into this?
I tell them to listen to Susan and Anastasia. No, there really has been some good advice here, and I would echo much of it. I guess I'll take the question from the perspective of someone who really is interested in the public interest advocacy avenue of being engaged in international environmental law. And generally, I'll start with the student perspective. I agree with Susan that you don't need to focus overly much on any particular area of the law. What I'm looking for when I'm hiring someone who is a good lawyer or has shown a facility for the law and think well about the law. And really, I want someone who has some breadth. one example I often use is, we're trying to change the behavior often of corporations with respect to environmental matters, and you can't do that without some understanding of how corporations function. Before you take a corporations law class, you can be looking into international environmental law. But I do think, and I didn't take environmental law courses in law school, but I did take international law courses, and when I look to hire a young lawyer, one area that I really do want them to have is some understanding of international law, because it's different, it's a different beat from U.S. law. So it's not as easy to take your understanding of U.S. environmental law or other areas of U.S. law and automatically understand international law. That said, I don't think you can't get into it if you haven't studied international law. I just think you can build some experience. And then the other thing that we really look for is, in addition to someone who is a good lawyer and legal thinker and has a breadth of understanding, is someone who has a real interest and passion and passion for the issues that we're working on. And I think that Anastasia's example of how her suggestions or hints at how she got to where she is a great example of what I would recommend young lawyers or law students do, which is to do as many things as you can to both build your experience and show your passion for these issues. And don't be afraid to do a lot of different things, particularly at the early stages of your career. I think the common legal path looks going into a firm and staying there, nearly forever, and maybe then branching out later. But I think it's important to build that experience. And for a young lawyer and a law student, many of the opportunities are short-term opportunities. I wouldn't hesitate to take those and build your experience that way.
Okay, before I ask my next question, I am hearing a lot of background noise. Is it only me, or is anybody else hearing that?
Here it is well.
Okay, so maybe if the tech people can figure out what that is. But Martin, one question that I've sometimes asked is, law students ask me, if I go to work for a big Wall Street type law firm, and I later decide that I want to go into the public interest sector, will I be tainted in the view of the potential employers? Will they be unhappy that I work for some big corporations before I went into this field? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And let me also say that I'll ask the people who are not speaking to put their phones on mute to see if that has any effect on the noise problem we're having.
So that's a good question, Michael. And my answer is absolutely not. There's no pain, at least from a short stint at a law firm. I worked at a law firm, a big private firm, for a couple of years. I have recently hired a young lawyer who worked for several years for an Australian law firm representing coal companies. And we are right now doing a lot of work to stop the expansion of coal mining in Australia, and it has been very helpful to have her knowledge of how the system works and how the coal companies think in order to do this work. The thing that I will say is that it is important to have some basis for us to know that that you're going to be willing to and able to take a strong stand with respect to corporations or the government where necessary. I mean, we do sue the government. We take actions very frequently that are contrary to the short-term profit interests of corporations, and so we want to know that you're going to be comfortable zealously advocating those kinds of positions. But I don't think simply going into a law firm is going to preclude you from being able to do that. And in fact, it can be a very, very good way to get training early in your career. The one thing I'll add to that, Michael, is just a note of caution on a practical level. At least in my experience, it is very common for people to go into law firms and find themselves stuck with the golden handcuffs. You know, they make a lot of money there. They buy a house with a big mortgage or cars with big payments, and either don't want to or feel unable to move away from that. So if you go to a law firm and you want to move into public interest, or for that matter, I think government practice, just be careful about not getting yourself stuck that way.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask, Martin. You did refer to the importance of taking some international law classes while you're in law school. I'd be interested in hearing from Susan and Anastasia about your thoughts on course, for those listeners who are still in law school, particular course offerings that are especially important to have while you're in law school, or other choices to make while you're in law school.
That's someone responsible for the curriculum in international law. I do think almost every student should take at least 1 to 2 credits worth of public international law, if that is possible, because I think it's absolutely critical to understand the role of treaties, and the role of treaties, speaking to an American audience here, I know we might have some other folks joining from other countries, but particularly understanding sort of U.S. foreign relations and the treaty process. So public international law, I think, is absolutely critical. But I would also suggest, for those of you who are interested in sort of the role of trade, international trade law is really critical. There's the WTO appellate body and dispute panel, for those who may have taken some classes in this area, the shrimp and turtle, the dolphin and tuna cases, the tire cases. All of these are trade cases, but they're trade cases with really significant sort of environmental content. And so I would suggest a trade class for anyone who is interested in this area.
Great. Susan?
Well, I would agree that international law is helpful background. I took one course in international law at Columbia, and drew on that definitely when I got to the State Department. I think other courses, though, that are not related to international law are also useful, especially courses that just force you to deal with difficult subject matter. At Columbia, I thought federal conflicts of laws, corporate tax, those kind of courses, even though they're not related subject matter-wise to international law, I felt were good brain-teasing subjects that I think helped me become a better lawyer. I also think some skill-related experience is useful in law school. Like you wouldn't think that maybe moot court would be that relevant to the State Department, but the ability to sort of think on your feet and listen to arguments and be able to rebut and find distinctions quickly were, really useful skills in the place where I work. So I guess I would agree with the other panels that you should think broadly about what constitutes good preparation. I mean, some people do come to our office and say, oh, I took human rights and I had an internship in India, so I have great background for the State Department. But I guess I kind of look at, that's all great and it shows a lot of interest, but I tend to favor the applicant who put themselves through kind of difficult courses and has sort of skills that will be relevant, not just maybe knowledge and experience.
Martin, is there anything you'd like to add on that particular question?
No, I don't think so. I do agree with that. Building the skills is really important. A basic understanding of international law is useful. Probably some understanding of environmental law and/or issues, but you can build the skills in many different ways. I agree.
And let me remind people that if you would like to pose a question, please send an email to events@asil.org, and we'll get to your questions. Let me now ask the question: where are the jobs, and as you look forward, where do you think the jobs will be? Who are the kinds of employers that you think will be especially likely to be hiring international environmental lawyers in the in the future. Susan, could I start with you?
I may not be the best person on the panel to ask. I don't really follow that much where the jobs would be. I have a gut feeling that climate change is going to be a growth industry, but I'm not sure if that's on the international front or on the domestic front, kind of around the world. So I defer to others.
Okay, Anastasia, how about you?
Sure. There's a couple places that I think that there are opportunities. Now, some of these are not going to be entry level, but I think with some experience under your belt, there's quite a few jobs that are available in the United Nations system. For folks who are under the age, I believe it's of 35, there is a UN Young Professionals program. There is also a program in the World Bank for young professionals that's available. And these are competitive sort of opportunities, but there is a chance for folks to be able to work on issues involving, in the case of the World Bank, looking at sort of multilateral bank portfolios, and obviously environmental and social concerns are critical there. I think those are possibilities. And one other possibility that from talking to people in the field, there's growing interest in sort of corporate social responsibility programs. And so this can very much be informed on various levels, the sort of implementing international environmental legal principles, like the polluter pays principle, for example.
Martin, what do you think?
Well, I think it's easier to answer where there ought to be international environmental law jobs, but you know, certainly on the international side, one thing this question makes me think is it's hard, I think, to find jobs that are really explicitly international environmental law jobs. There are many jobs that are international, and there are many that are environmental, but the two don't come together as often. Anastasia mentioned some good examples, but it might be important, if you're interested in this area, to think about which of those two is most important to you and find a place where you may be able to bring in the international side of it. I mean, you know, if you're working for a multilateral corporation and you're an environmental law expert, it is going to be harder and harder, I think, not to be involved in environmental matters, or international matters, sorry. And if Susan is successful in her job, hopefully we'll have a good climate agreement that will force and motivate lots of corporate activity that has to look at international matters in terms of figuring out how corporations deal with the changing markets with respect to climate change. And you know, on the other side, you can find places, I think, where you are focusing on international matters, organizations that focus on international matters, like the World Bank, and they are recognizing that there are more and more places where the environment is an international issue. So some of it is that open-mindedness that Anastasia mentioned, and bringing your creativity into your job and finding the places to draw the second part of those two into the work you're doing. There are also more and more public interest organizations that are including international environmental work as part of their work, and so you can look there as well.
One thing that I would add is that partly it depends on what is your definition of international environmental law. If your motivation is to help the international environment, or to help the world environment on an international basis, there's also a great deal of work done in the energy realm. Clearly, the most important thing that has to be done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is a massive transformation of the energy system away from fossil and toward renewables, as well as efficiency. And that is going to, and I think we're increasingly going to see a lot of international transactions that involve the construction of new renewable energy sources. And so a lot of that law will be in the realm of finance and contracting and procurement and all of those kinds of things, which, and often it'll be transboundary work, at least, that'll involve the laws of several different countries, even though it may not involve much work with treaties and public international law. Some of that will. And also, as Martin alluded, depending on what comes out of Paris and what follows it, I think we may see a lot more in the realm of international emissions trading and other kinds of international flows. There certainly is a need for a lot of international flow of assistance money and adaptation assistance. Another thing that I see becoming an increasingly important issue in the decades to come are the whole issues of migration. We're seeing now this horrible crisis in Europe with a lot of people coming in and not knowing where they should go. The projections are all that with climate change, the numbers involved will be much larger, and so I'm afraid that what we see now in Europe is a foretaste of much larger problems to come. Those will invariably raise a whole host of legal issues. Some of them, many of them involve international law. A lot of them involve the domestic law of the countries where the people are coming from and where they are going. But I think that the overall challenges that are going to be faced are going to be, much even larger and more challenging than we have now.
Can I add one point to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think you both make a very good point that it may depend on how you define international. So if you define international as public international law, the creation of that law, it may be narrower than if you are interested in just practicing environmental law with a foreign bent. And I'm thinking of, so last week there was a U.S.-China cities summit, just to give an example, where many U.S. and Chinese cities took on pledges above and beyond the national pledges of the United States and China. You wouldn't have thought that somebody working for a city or a state in the United States would necessarily be doing something international related when it came to environment, but somebody in those places must have been keeping an eye on both the Paris process, because these were kind of in contemplation of the Paris conference, and what was going on in another country. And I think there's going to be, so there are places to look that you would not traditionally have thought would require some kind of an eye on the goings-on internationally, but I think will in the future require that kind of expertise, or at least aspect to a job that might otherwise be domestically focused.
One question that has come in, let me read this to you. Do you use social media for networking purposes? Do you find that to be the case among colleagues in the field? Would you recommend doing so? Anyone like to respond to that?
I'll take a crack at that to begin with. Not especially. I mean, there are sort of networks such as LinkedIn that I think are valuable if you have a connection, maybe you're 2 connections removed from someone. What I really think is valuable for anyone entering this field is to become a member of a lot of the professional organizations. So obviously the American Society of International Law is one of the sort of primary organizations, but you can also become a member of the American Bar Association. There's a section on environmental law and energy resources. There's also a section on international law. Each of those sections has an international environmental law group. And you can also become involved with the International Union on the Conservation of Nature. These are all groups that have they're open to participation. So that's probably the advice I would give. Is that's one of the best ways to network.
And I'll just add, if you're in D.C., the Environmental Law Institute has lots and lots of programs dealing with international environmental law. If you're in New York, the New York City Bar Association has a committee on international environmental law, as well as a committee on environmental law. And I suspect that's the case with some of the bar associations and some of the larger cities. Martin, any thoughts on the networking, whether it's electronic or otherwise?
No, I don't use the social media for networking purposes, but I do agree with Anastasia. All of those different kinds of organizational connections are useful. I frankly, my sense is that lawyers are a little bit behind the times in terms of using things like LinkedIn, but it could just be me.
Susan?
Yeah, I'm also not much of a social media person, but I think personal connections are fine. Like, for example, when I give talks various places in DC or at law schools, people are usually, young people, not shy about coming up and talking and giving me their card or asking me about externships, internships, and some of those have actually turned into jobs for people uh, who were who were bold. And I would say that I and other people in my office are, you know, very open to that kind of personal connection.
I think some of this may be generational. All four of us are well north of 30, and I don't know if I suspect that if we had a younger demographic on this call, we might have a different response to this. But I think that that there is that generational difference. Another question that has come in is, what is different about practicing in the international environmental law field as compared to other areas of international law? Susan, can you take that one to start?
Yeah, I would say, in my experience, because I've done a lot of different types of international law. So environment is different. Well, our counterparts are sometimes different internationally. So with many international law topics that are more like bread and butter topics, your counterpart is always somebody at a foreign ministry, a lawyer at another, a State Department equivalent. On international environmental law negotiations, our legal counterpart is often from the Ministry of Environment of another country, and many countries have set up climate change specific ministries, and you'll often have a lawyer who's dedicated to the climate change issue. It's a different dynamic. They tend to know less about what we would consider mainstream international law and treaty law, and they seem to be, so focused on environmental law that we're not always on the same page in terms of the basics of international law. So that's a bit of a difference. The negotiations are also much more open than traditional, maybe national security type issues. At an international environmental law negotiation, they're, unless you go into closed session towards the end for the real nitty-gritty negotiation, you tend to have NGOs, businesses, all kinds of outside groups watching the whole thing. That's very atypical if you're working in some other field of international law, like arms control or criminal law. It would never occur to us that a person outside the government would be sitting in the room while we're negotiating with another country. So that's also a very different dynamic, and it changes how you present your positions. If you go in with your opening in a normal negotiation, you wouldn't start with your final position, but in the environmental world, if you start with something less than your final position, then you're criticized for not being forthcoming enough. But if you start with a position for which you wouldn't be criticized, then you have nowhere left to go. So it's a very different dynamic when you're negotiating in public than when you're negotiating in private. So I would say those are maybe two of the differences I've seen.
Great. We only have about a minute before we have to sign off, but a question came in, and I want to be sure to address it. The question is, can you talk about the value of the Jessup Moot Court in building skills for an international law career? Is there anybody who would like to address that?
Well, yeah, I think it's very valuable, both substantively, because you're being confronted with a hard topic that somebody created deliberately to be hard, and the skills of having to advocate and think on your feet. So I would say it's very valuable.
I think that Jessup is valuable regardless of whether you are pursuing a career in international law or not. You get the briefing experience and you get the oral argument experience, so it doesn't really matter what your future career will hold. I wanted to make one quick point also that I think is a difference between international environmental law and other forms of international law is the idea that a lot of international environmental law is ideally science-based. And so I think in terms of education, it can be very valuable to grow a knowledge of an area of science, whether it's sort of chemistry, if you're interested in like the chemical conventions, or biology, if you're interested in the biodiversity conventions, or issues with energy if you're interested in pursuing a career there. So I do think science, having an enthusiasm for science, is really important for international environmental law.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm often asked, you need to have a scientific background. You do not need to have a scientific background, but you should be interested in science. The judges and juries won't be able to do integral calculus either, so you don't have to be at that quantitative level, but you need to be interested in it. Well, regrettably, we are out of time, but I think that this has been a terrific discussion, and I want to thank Susan and Anastasia and Martin for the sage advice that they offered, and I want to thank the American Society of International Law for making this opportunity available to all of us, and I hope that our audience has benefited. Thank you all, and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.